now we're getting into the crux of the matter and truly publishing our podcast in different platforms. Interchangeably referring to Apple Podcasts as either that or iTunes. Earlier in 2018, iTunes, or the podcast side of iTunes, got a rebrand to be Apple Podcasts. So that is the proper nomenclature moving forward. However, it is still colloquially referred to as iTunes. So I will continue to switch back and forth. But if you are using any official documentation, then you should always refer to it as Apple Podcasts. So just a quick note on the naming here. Up until some point in 2018, it was iTunes or podcasts on iTunes, and now it's Apple Podcasts. So you may have remembered from an earlier video that we need to grab our feed to submit to Apple Podcasts. And we can do that in our WordPress site by going to Podcast Settings and then to Publishing. This will provide us with the URL that we need to submit to iTunes. So I'm going to copy this. If you have created a specific series or you want to have multiple podcasts in one site, your feed will be the URL /series slug. So if you called one of the series public episodes, it would be public-episodes here. But we're going to grab this. So now that we have our feed, let's go over to the Apple Podcast side of things. We're going to submit our podcast over at iTunes Connect, which you can access by going to itunesconnect.apple.com and logging in with your iTunes or Apple ID. If you don't have an Apple ID, you're going to need to create one using one of Apple's 3 services. And this link will be in the description for this lesson, but you can do it during setup of an Apple device. You can create it with the Apple App Store, or if you don't have an Apple device, you can download iTunes and create it that way. Either way, you'll need to create an account separately, and you will need that Apple ID to log in to iTunes Connect. So from here, we can click on Podcast Connect, and you could see that immediately we are presented with this RSS feed. Now, if you got to iTunes Connect or Podcast Connect a different way, you might see a page that looks more like this. Maybe you just see the plus sign here. If you don't have any podcasts, naturally you won't see any podcasts here. If you did make it to this page instead, click the plus button and you'll be brought to the same screen that we were just at. And here you can paste your podcast feed URL. Make sure to clear any space from around it. Click validate. Because we're using Seriously Simple Podcasting, this should validate with no problems. And you can see that all of the information from our feed got pulled into iTunes. And you will notice that our names, episodes, seasons, even the trailer are showing up just as we organize them within the WordPress website. One important thing to note is you see that there are some special characters that are breaking here. Specifically use that excerpt field that we were looking at when we were creating our first episode. Where you can create a specific excerpt without the quotes, but still keep the quotes and other special markup in the description. Either way, everything is looking good here, so we have validated our feed, so now we can click Submit. When we click Submit, our podcast is submitted for review, and Apple will email us once the review process is complete. Now, that process could take anywhere from a day to a week or more, so you'll just have to make sure to watch your email to make sure that your podcast gets approved. Now, before we go, in the rest of this course, we are going to look at a couple of other major podcast directories, including Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. But there are dozens, maybe even hundreds of podcast directories. how do we make sure our podcast gets to those? Well, luckily, most of them use iTunes or Stitcher or TuneIn as a basis for their directories. So they'll just basically look at what podcasts are in those directories and pull them into their own. So by submitting them to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and then looking at Google, we should be good.